Where we left off last time, the American government had come up with a plan to take British North America by surprise, attack before the declaration of war would reach London, and before a defense could be coordinated in Upper and Lower Canada. Brock has sent a message to one of his most deeply embedded Indian agents, Robert Dixon, asking about the disposition of the troops of Tecumseh's Confederacy. However, he sends that message on June 16th, 1812, and war is declared 2 days later before the message reaches Robert Dixon. So,
if we had Twitter, the War of 1812 would have never happened, frankly.
Honestly, if we had Twitter, the U.S. would probably have had a civil war first, because the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans were so disunited that they probably would have just killed each other if they could talk to each other all the time.
You know how weird it is that... I know this is a tangent. I know, Bennet, you and I have discussed this at length so many times. But the entire revolution happened because of increased taxes. And then as soon as the U.S. became an independent country, they immediately increased taxes.
Well, yeah, they figured that they needed to now fund all their own stuff and couldn't rely on grants from London, like Ontario would continue to do for the next, 50 years. So the Americans have a few problems with their surprise attack plan. The first one is, what army are they supposed to be doing this attack with, right? The U.S. Army, at the start of the war, has only 12,000 men. By comparison, British ground forces are 250,000 men in total. In Canada alone, the British Army has 6,000 regular troops just sitting around not doing anything while they're fighting the Napoleonic Wars. The U.S. Army is also volunteer only and has no measures to implement a draft, and no one is joining the Army because the shit conditions and shit pay. The U.S. Army is so unpopular, more people want to join the Navy, typically, at this time. The other issue is there are tens of thousands of state militia, which we would now call the National Guard, but they are poorly trained, poorly equipped, and most importantly, their contract explicitly states that they do not have to step foot on foreign soil if they do not want to. This will be a persistent issue throughout the war. The state militia can also not be mobilized without the approval of the state government. While the war is popular in the South due to the economic conditions motivating it is not at all popular in the states closer to the Canadian border, and it is unclear if New England or New York will even allow their militia to participate. The other issue is who is going to lead this attack. It has been a couple decades since the U.S. had to fight any other great power, and its officer staff has seriously decayed. They only basically have 3 generals to choose from: Henry Dearborn, Abraham Eustis, and William Hull. Now, Dearborn is a famous war hero of the American Revolution who served with George Washington at basically all of his top battles. So he's everyone loves him. The issue is, it's been 40 years, and the years have not been kind to our friend Dearborn. He is now incredibly fat and senile. He is frequently confused and does not know what is happening.
Is this the guy from Dearborn, Michigan? Is he named after? Or
Yeah.
is he named after? Okay.
Abraham Eustis is the nephew of the Secretary of War, William Eustis. He has been promoted to general because of his connection to the government and no other reason. He has no combat experience of any kind.
Hell yeah.
Their third option is William Hull, who is a charismatic lesser hero of the American Revolution, who during the Revolution worked in military intelligence and as a militia captain. He is currently the governor of Michigan and moonlights as an officer in the U.S. Army. Picking from these 3 men, the U.S. government goes with Dearborn because he's simply the most experienced. Dearborn dispatches Hull.
Was this not like a Goldilocks thing where they're like, this guy's too old and senile, this guy's too young and has no experience doing anything? The third one is, let's go with the first one. Is that what they just did?
Well, all these men are about the same age, but
Okay.
Dearborn is just the most decrepit.
Okay.
Hull is not senile or fat, but he's just less popular. So Dearborn dispatches Hull to Detroit with 2,500 men and orders him to immediately attack Sandwich, which is now Windsor, and begins sweeping east towards Niagara and York. Eustis is dispatched to Buffalo, and Dearborn heads to Albany to oversee the invasion. The third issue with this plan, besides what army's going to do it and who's going to lead it, is that the British in North America know the war is happening before Dearborn does. Brock and Prévost have both been aware of the specter of invasion for some years now, as we've already established. In the last episode, we talked about how they beefed up the militia and built fortifications along the whole border. Furthermore, the Indian Department has also been aware of the upcoming war and has a bunch of contingencies in place to sabotage American operations if a war happens. Finally, the British in Canada are saved by the accidental treason of an American merchant desperate to save his cross-border investment. This is how Brock and Prévost learn that the war is happening before William Hull even arrives in Detroit to attack Windsor. John Jacob Astor is an American merchant and owner of a trading company called the Northwest Company, which specializes in fur and cross-border trade with the Canadians. He lives in D.C., so he is one of the first people to hear that the war is breaking out. So, realizing that once the war is declared, the border will be shut down for civilian traffic, he outruns the postal service to the border. Basically, he gets on his horse and just death rides all the way to the Quebec border in order to save his inventory, which is currently sitting in Montreal. He informs his comrades in Montreal that war has been declared and that the company's inventory needs to be purged and sent south as soon as possible. The British, of course, intercept him, get this information from him, so Prévost and Brock hear that the war has been declared before the general staff of the American army. Now, as we talked about before, Brock has sent a letter to Robert Dixon telling him to report to him about the things about his the disposition of Tecumseh's troop. But the thing is, the Indian Department that Dixon works for is also now aware that the war has been declared, so before the message from Brock reaches Dixon, Dixon immediately activates his contingency plan. He takes hundreds of indigenous warriors from Tecumseh's Confederacy and walks north to Lake Superior, where he plans to attack Mackinac Island. So, are you guys aware with the layout of the Great Lakes, right? Maybe look at a map if you aren't. So... One of the Great Lakes is Lake Michigan. That's the lake that Chicago is on. Lake Michigan has sort of this small kind of gap that connects it to Lake Huron. Mackinac Island sits directly in that gap. So in order to sail from Lake Huron to Lake Michigan, you need to sail past Mackinac. So the Indian Department's plan is that they are going to take Mackinac Island. They inform Brock, and he agrees. So he dispatches a runner to a local garrison asking them to help Dixon when he arrives. So Dixon and the local garrison commander link up. The two men lead a joint British indigenous force to the island. Off the coast of the island, they run into another American trader named Michael Dousman, who, as luck would have it, is close personal friends with Robert Dixon. He cheerfully informs Dixon that the governor of Fort Mackinac, the commander of the fort on the island, is not aware that the war has been declared. So, Dousman goes to the island and convinces the civilian population that the British are about to attack and evacuates them ahead of the battle. Dixon and Roberts then attack the fort, but before any shots are fired, the commander of the fort immediately surrenders. So Mackinac is captured without a shot fired. The indigenous warriors are actually upset because they wanted to kill American soldiers. So, in order to prevent them from killing the prisoners, Dixon confiscates some cows from the civilian population and just releases the cows onto the island for the indigenous to let off some steam and hunt. So the first battle of the war occurs, the battle for Mackinac Island, with no shots fired and no casualties on either side. And now Chicago is cut off from seaborne supplies because Lake Michigan is now sealed. While Mackinac Island is being captured, Hull arrives in Detroit. So the first issue that Hull has is an issue that will continue to occur throughout the war. He has a force that's mostly militia with some regulars. The regulars are commanded by officers of the regular army, whereas the militia are commanded by politicians and lawyers. those politicians and lawyers have grossly inflated ranks. Like, a lot of them are colonels or generals, even though they have no experience in very small armies under their command. This leads to an issue where the regular officers frequently refuse to take orders from their militia commanders. Also, as soon as he hits the border, Hull means to attack Windsor, or Sandwich as it is called then, and orders his men to cross the border. Immediately, the attack breaks down as the militia debate amongst themselves whether or not they are actually going to cross the border and attack. Eventually, he manages to convince them to attack. As he attacks, he finds that the British have already evacuated the town because not only are they aware the war has been declared, they are also aware exactly how many troops Hull has, because Hull's mail has been captured by British spies. Hull advances into
This is
Sandwich.
the most exhilarating start to a war, probably in history.
How many days are we into this war?
Like a couple.
It's like everybody just knows everything about everyone constantly.
Well, the
Yeah,
Americans...
they're playing like open hand.
They're playing chess.
Yeah, they forgot that they're like both operating the same war table for their planning.
Yeah.
So he arrives in Sandwich, and the British have already gone, and the only people left in the town are American sympathizers who greet them as heroes. Then Hull does something that sort of destroys any opportunity, destroys the America's opportunity to really win in Upper Canada in any meaningful way. You see, as we established in the previous episode, right, the majority of Canada's population, in Ontario at least, are Americans, right? They kind of want the Americans to win. Once the news of the war reaches the civilian population, several civilian municipal governments in Ontario release statements urging their population to join the American army when it arrives, so that the war will end as quickly as possible, with Upper Canada being annexed. But Hull makes two critical mistakes. The first is, in order to bolster supplies, he begins expropriating farms in southern Ontario. As he advances, he seizes land and food from the local farmers, many of whom are Americans. Suddenly, the dismayed American population of Upper Canada doesn't want the United States to advance anymore, because as Hull advances, he is stealing from them. Remember, many of these people have come to Upper Canada because there are no taxes, very little government presence, and free land. If the Americans are coming in and destroying those benefits, why would they want the Americans to win? Famously, Hull runs into a friend of his, an American sympathizer named Babby, is his last name. He expropriates Babby's property, and when Babby protests, citing his friendship with Hull, Hull says, "The circumstances have changed." This line will come up again later. So, public opinion is shifting against Hull, and then he does something even dumber. He releases a propaganda leaflet intended to prevent Ontarians from joining the militia. The following letter. A proclamation. Inhabitants of Canada, after 30 years of peace and prosperity, the United States have been driven to arms. The injuries and aggressions, the insults and indignities of Great Britain have once more left them no alternative but manly resistance or unconditional submission. The army under my command has invaded your country, and the standard of the United States waves on the territory of Canada. To the peaceful, unoffending inhabitant, it brings neither danger nor difficulty. I come to find enemies, not to make them. I come to protect you, not to injure you. Then he goes on to say he's here to protect the person, property, and rights, tells them to remain in their homes, and then he says, "No white man found fighting or found to have fought by the side of an Indian will be taken prisoner. Instant destruction will be his lot." Basically threatening summary execution on anyone found to have cooperated with the indigenous people now or in the past. So not only are the American farmers upset with him for stealing land, they are now afraid that if he advances too far, he will start executing people en masse due to suspicion of allying with the natives. Hull's warning
So far in this war, a battle happened where nothing happened. Another battle happened where nothing happened. A guy walked over the border, pissed off all the people that were on his side, and then doubled down and pissed them off even more.
Yes, exactly.
They own a lot more of the land, eh? Like, the Americans are winning right now.
So my favorite Canadian pop historian, Pierre Burton, makes the bold claim that the switch in public opinion following the reality of Hull's invasion was so severe that if the War of 1812 never happened, Ontario would now happily be an American state. That was the severity of the opinion switch. Before this point, Ontario was sort of like Texas would be later, overwhelmingly filled with American citizens who wanted to rejoin the United States. Now it is full of American citizens who hate the United States and want it to lose. So with Hull advancing into Ontario, Prévost orders Brock to push Hull back out of Ontario, but not to advance into American territory. Prévost has received orders from London upon the realization that war has been declared, ordering him to end the war as quickly as possible without stepping foot on American soil, if he can get away with it. Until Napoleon is defeated, Canada will not receive reinforcements, so it needs to end the conflict in a status quo as fast as they possibly can before the Americans are able to mobilize completely. So Prévost sends Brock down. Brock says, sure, I'll drive Hull out of Ontario. Meanwhile, Prévost dispatches his sidekick. Now, every major commander of this war has a sort of this lovable sidekick character who follows them around. Brock has this Irish bartender called Alexander Nichols, who he will promote summarily to Colonel Nichols with no military experience so that he can have him just in his staff. So Prévost's sidekick is a guy called Baines. So he sends this guy Baines to Dearborn's HQ for a parley. Because what Prévost wants to do is he wants to negotiate a ceasefire until diplomatic relations can be normalized. So he sends Baines to Dearborn's HQ. Baines takes a circuitous route from Montreal down to Albany, which is sort of along the border between New York and New England, and Lake Champlain is in the middle of that. Baines has orders to interview local civilians as he does so. He's to determine what people in New York think of Britain and Canada, and to figure out what exactly the American plans are and how the Americans plan to attack, and with what troops. So Baines heads south on his sort of pseudo-spying mission. He interviews civilians along the way and discovers something astonishing. The Americans seem to have completely forgotten why they won the American Revolution. You see, in the American Revolution, until France and Spain joined on America's side, the Americans pretty consistently lost every straight-up battle they fought in. They were fighting against a far superior regular army with a bunch of colonial hicks, basically. The strategy that worked for the Americans were surprise attacks, defensive guerrilla fighting, the fact that American troops could melt into the civilian population basically at will without detection, which turned the American Revolution into this proto-Vietnam quagmire for the British government, right? But the Americans have forgotten that. They seem to be under the delusion that the American militia is equal in strength to British regulars, or even that American regulars are equal to British regulars. From what he can gather,
and with the numbers, you'd assume that not only are they equal, but they assume that they're way better.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. The British have far fewer regular troops, but those regular troops are very good. So Baines interviews local civilians who seem to have forgotten why America has won the American Revolution, and he eventually arrives at Dearborn's HQ. He talks to Dearborn. The conversation from Baines' recollection is a bit confusing. Dearborn is, after all, quite senile. But it becomes clear to Baines that there's not going to be a realistic negotiation. The war is decided, it's going to happen. So Baines returns to Montreal. But before he goes, he asks Dearborn if he can take a look around the fortifications in upstate New York. He knows Dearborn will say no, but he might as well try, right? To his astonishment, Dearborn says, go ahead. So Baines is allowed to inspect American defenses in upstate New York, and returns to Montreal with detailed illustrations and like floor plans of the American forts around Lake Champlain.
Oh my god, bros.
After Baines leaves, Dearborn activates the New York militia successfully, and then heads to New England to try and summon the militias of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Connecticut. He's going to need the New England militia because the people in New England are very familiar with Canada's terrain. They live right next to it, after all, right? So he arrives in New England, which is full of Federalist legislatures and governors, meets with the governors, and is informed by those governments that not only will those states not mobilize their militia to help him, they have already signed a peace treaty with New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. So the New England states have effectively already left the war and refused to help the American government. When Dearborn tells them that that's just not, like, legal, you can't sign a peace treaty with a foreign country while the U.S. is at war with them, the New England governors threaten to secede from the Union unless they are allowed to pretend the war is not happening. So a bewildered Dearborn returns to Albany without the New England militia. So he orders New York militia commander Stephen Van Rensselaer to make do with the forces he already has and dispatches him to Niagara to link up with Abraham Eustis. Van Rensselaer's job is going to be to invade across the Niagara River and capture the escarpment around Queenston, the town of Queenston. But more on that later. So Hull is kind of dicking around in southern Ontario.
Wait, at this point, was it the British hot water tank to the U.S. military? Is that what happened? They have the floor plans?
Yeah, basically. Yeah, Baines, who's Prévost's like aide-de-camp, has basically compiled a bunch of like detailed illustrations of American fortifications in upstate New York. So Hull is dicking around in southern Ontario.
Is that common for them to just give all that information?
No.
out?
That's why Baines wasn't expecting Dearborn to say yes. He thought he would ask as a courtesy and just like to see what would happen. And to his surprise, the senile Dearborn says go ahead. So Hull is moving around southern Ontario, alienating the locals, and hears that Brock is on his way. So Hull, afraid to fight the British regulars, begins to withdraw. And at the same time as he's withdrawing, his supplies from Ohio are cut off because Tecumseh's Confederacy has joined the war. Tecumseh ambushes and cuts off American supplies at the Battle of Brownstown. So Hull no longer has access to food or ammunition from the American government. He has to withdraw not just from Sandwich, but into the walls of Fort Detroit, because he is no longer able to supply an occupation. Brock, on his way, gathers the militia from York and advances west. On the way there, Tecumseh crosses the border and links up with Brock. The two men meet and are, shall we say, quite impressed by each other. Let me read the quotes. So the two meet. Tecumseh shows up at Brock's tent. Tecumseh shows up completely naked except for a loincloth and a necklace which has a dinner plate-sized silver medal around on his chest. On the medal is stamped a basically life-size portrait of George III. So Tecumseh meets Brock in that outfit. The two men discuss their plans, and they part, and Brock says to his friend Nichols the following: "A more sagacious and gallant warrior does not, I believe, exist. He has the admiration of everyone who has ever conversed with him." Tecumseh's comment to his own warriors is the following: "This is a man." So the two men are quite impressed by each other. So
there's a famous painting of them meeting each other, right? Have you seen it?
Is there?
It's like you can in the painting. They don't show him looking as seditious, but there's a famous painting where they both look very impressed with each other.
Oh, they actually, yeah, they don't show him almost completely nude, and the medal in that he's wearing is much larger in real life.
Yeah. He's wearing clothes, but you can see like in their facial expression, they're both like dang.
I should note that Tecumseh and Brock are both recorded as being very handsome by people who meet them. They're both quite hot. Now, Brock's plan that he works out with the Tecumseh's army is that the British troops will land south of Detroit when they cross the river between Ontario and Michigan, while the British artillery distracts the fort. Basically, the British artillery is going to be set up on the Canadian side of the riverbank, shelling Detroit, while the British advance across the river. Meanwhile, Indigenous troops will land further south, out of eyesight of the fort, like too far away to be seen. Then they will sneak into the woods and then sneak up and north of Detroit, basically encircling the city. The plan is Tecumseh and his warriors, once they are north of Detroit, will begin marching out of the forest and back in. The idea is the Americans are not able to tell Indigenous people apart. So seeing this circular marching pattern, they will assume the Indigenous people have way more soldiers than they actually do.
Mm-hmm.
See, Brock is outnumbered significantly and attacking a fort. There is no way he will win in a stand-up fight. He needs to rely on trickery.
I've always wanted to know the calculation that people would do of how long they're supposed to walk in and out of the forest. Because they want to know that they have more numbers than they do, but at the same time, like, you don't want it to be, like, unbelievable or long enough that the enemies figure out that they've seen the same guy, like, 6 times.
Well, I suppose it's a combination of the fact that the white Americans can't tell the Indigenous people from each other, and also it's sort of at long-range eyesight. Like, they're not looking at them with binoculars.
Yeah.
The battle commences. Brock lands south of the fort. Tecumseh lands further south, and they start executing the plan. The artillery duel starts, and the British artillery begins shelling the interior of Fort Detroit. Hull begins to organize defenses, but then his daughter is struck by the British artillery barrage and killed. Hull panics and enters a catatonic state. He retreats to his tent and wordlessly sits, unable to give orders. His subordinates desperately try to organize like a defense and a sally out from the fort to attack Brock's troops, but are unable to actually get the militia to agree to leave the fort because they're too scared of Tecumseh's soldiers. So, Brock halts south of the fort and calls a parley demanding surrender. Hull agrees and orders his men to surrender to Brock. However, Hull's subordinates refuse to surrender. Like, they go, Hull's second in command goes from, like, guy to guy to see if anyone was willing to give up the American colors to Brock, and they can't find anyone. Eventually, Hull himself goes out and surrenders when Brock threatens to unleash Tecumseh's warriors on the soldiers and civilians currently sheltered in Fort Detroit. Hull returns to the fort, informs his subordinates that the Tecumseh's warriors are going to kill everyone in the fort if they don't surrender, which scares the Americans into surrendering. So the Americans give up and are captured by the inferior army. Brock instantly becomes a hero in Upper Canada for defeating Hull's invading army. And since no battle actually happened, they basically recover all the pristine weaponry and ammunition storage that is currently sitting in Detroit, which is used to arm the now rapidly growing Canadian militia. When Prévost hears about the siege of Detroit, he's actually furious. See, Prévost's orders were to Brock: under no circumstances are you to advance into the United States. And here Brock has captured the largest city in Michigan.
We now have huge drama over a battle where effectively nothing happened.
Exactly.
I don't know, but that's funny. I mean...
Well, okay, a lot happened, but at the same time, in terms of the battle, nothing happened.
Was this the first time anything was stolen in Detroit?
Actually, at this point, Detroit was almost entirely French Canadians. When Brock was advancing to Detroit, some of his Canadian militia were actually greeted by people they knew personally. And, like, you know, because they were, like, Canadians living in Detroit. So Prévost and Dearborn immediately sign an armistice. See, Prévost does not want to provoke the Americans by capturing American territory, and Dearborn's initial plan to have Hull encircle Niagara for the advance into Queenston has failed. So the two men agree to an armistice, and hostilities cease for the next 2 months between the British and the Americans. Meanwhile, in the lead-up of the Battle of Detroit, Tecumseh's Confederacy has joined the war, as we said before. They were raiding the supply lines, which forced Hull to retreat into the fort. While the war between the two white countries is proceeding in a civil, if not comically stupid manner, it is an entirely different beast on the front between the indigenous and the Americans. When Hull heard about Dixon's capture of Mackinac, remember from earlier, Mackinac is that island at the mouth of the Michigan, between Michigan and Huron, he gives an order to Chicago to evacuate its population into Ohio. So the garrison commander in Chicago gathers up the women and children and begins the march east. Unfortunately for the militia commander of Chicago, Nathan Heald, and the Chicagoan civilians, they are about to pass through Potawatomi territory. If you remember from the first episode, the Potawatomi were those people who killed their own chief at that meeting between Tecumseh and William Henry Harrison because he sold land to the whites. The Potawatomi were also the majority of the population of Prophetstown, the old capital of Tecumseh's Confederacy that Harrison burned down. In short, the Potawatomi hate white Americans and want revenge. When a scout spots the convoy of civilians, the Potawatomi dispatch 600 warriors to assemble in an ambush position and encircle the caravan. When Heald's men spot the Potawatomi encircling them, they immediately abandon the caravan and charge uphill at the indigenous warriors. The Potawatomi easily dispatch the small American militia force, leaving the civilians defenseless. The Potawatomi then descend on the caravan. According to survivors Sergeant Walter Jordan, who was spared due to being recognized as behaving honorably towards the Potawatomi in the past, the warriors proceed to decapitate 12 of the children, mock and murder a black slave named Silly and her infant child, torture Heald to death, and over the next 5 days, kill all except 42 of the civilian and militia who they enslave. So, the American response to the massacre of Chicago's... Sorry, Trey?
Wait, what's left in Chicago then?
Not much. Remember, Hull is evacuating Chicago because of the capture of Mackinac Island.
Yeah, so Chicago was like basically decimated for a while.
Yeah, I mean, there weren't very many people living there anyways. This was basically when it started having a sizable population. But anyways, the Potawatomi have slaughtered this caravan of civilians, right? The American response to the massacre of the Chicago civilians is swift and brutal. The dead civilians are revenged with a 3-pronged drive deep into the territory of the Confederacy. Over the next 2 months, thousands of indigenous civilians are murdered. 13 towns and villages of the Confederacy are burned to the ground and their populations slaughtered, enslaved, or scattered. Sadly, unlike the massacre of the Chicago civilians, little is recorded from the perspective of the victims of this violence. It takes several months of violence against the Confederacy's civilian population to slake the American bloodlust, and the American militia eventually withdraws from the savage Confederacy and returns to the skirmishing guerrilla warfare that will define this theater for the remainder of the war. So, while the war in Ontario is this sort of like circus of white troops fighting each other and then surrendering before anyone is killed, the war on the Western Front is an absolutely disgusting cycle of civilian violence.
Yeah.
One interesting thing is worth covering from the Chicago bloodbath after the fact. Some of the civilians did indeed escape. One was an unnamed American soldier who was enslaved by the Potawatomi. However, he was so popular once he was brought back to their homes, he was released by the Potawatomi and permitted to marry one of their women. He is freed from captivity and allowed to leave. He takes his wife up into the wilds of what is now Wisconsin, where he finds another indigenous woman that he also marries. In 1816, 2 years after the war ends, the Americans are surveying the Wisconsin territory, and his cabin and 2 wives are found. When asked if he would like to return to civilization now that the war is over, he declines. The surveyors mark the cabin and return home. When another wave of surveyors are sent to the area, the cabin has been abandoned, and the white man and his 2 indigenous wives have presumably retreated further west, avoiding the American creep of civilization. I thought that was just an interesting story. You used to be able to just do that, kind of just disappear into the frontier. We're kind of missing that these days.
Yeah, especially I was actually thinking about this a lot recently with like online presence and stuff. You really are at least in some way stuck. Like your digital footprint can always come back to you, and it's hard to exist without a digital footprint. You used to be able to straight up just like you could fuck off from one place and just instantly like have an entire new life where everyone would only know about you what you told them.
Yeah. Also,
and,
I think
it had its costs for sure, but yeah, that is something that's just a general concept that's impossible these days.
Mm-hmm. Honestly, I think probably a super majority of white men, even now, believe if they were in that man's position, they could have done the same thing. They could have been so cool, the Powhatan would have liberated them and allowed them to leave. You know,
they'd be one of the good ones.
Yeah. So, from around June, when the war started and Hull was defeated in Detroit, a couple months later in August, Stephen Van Rensselaer has arrived in Niagara and is preparing to attack across the Niagara River. Abraham Eustis has been reassigned to a different front, so Stephen Van Rensselaer is now the commanding officer of the region. Stephen Van Rensselaer is he's an interesting character. As his name suggests, he is ethnically Dutch and spoke Dutch as his first language growing up. His family has been in New York State so long that he is America's only legal feudal lord. He owns a feudal tract of land in the Hudson Valley with literal tenant farming peasants under him, who he is entitled to collect taxes from.
I thought they were done away with the feudal shit by this point.
This guy is basically the only one in America legally entitled to be a literal feudal lord. You could in some sense call the American Southern plantation owners feudal lords, but this guy is a feudal lord in the European sense, like a true actual medieval feudal lord.
That is crazy. I guess that's one of those things that like people don't realize America as a general younger country. They don't realize it intersected with a ton of different things. Like this all, like the Napoleonic War is huge in the history of the War of 1812. And most people think that like, despite that if you give them numbers, they'll probably recognize it. They still think that like the Napoleonic Wars are old. And the War of 1812 is like new old. You know, sort like vibes-wise, it still seems like there's a lot of time.
Yeah, they do kind of seem separate. But Van Rensselaer is actually quite popular in New York as a politician in the Democratic Republican Party because while he is entitled to collect feudal taxes from his tenant farmers, he forgoes these taxes, which has made him quite popular. So when the war starts, he is elected to lead the New York militia and placed in charge of the invasion of Ontario. As the militia general, he is allowed to sort of just appoint whoever he wants under him. So he places his cousin, Solomon Van Rensselaer, as his second in command, as a militia colonel. Van Rensselaer, despite being a literal feudal lord, his best friend is a man named John Lovett, a New York State poet of working class extraction who is a utopian socialist, like a pre-Marx communist and anti-war activist. So John Lovett has before this point written at great lengths about how there should be no war between Britain and America, and if there is, the working classes in those two countries should overthrow their governments and form like a united republic. He is categorically opposed to this war, but as a personal favor to his friend Stephen, he agrees to join the militia as a major. John Lovett's diary before the war is full of lamentations about the upcoming war and how he doesn't want it to happen. When the war starts, his diary entries switch to being about how miserable he is having to do this favor for his friend. But when he actually arrives at the front, the entries in his diary change. It turns out John Lovett kind of low-key loves war.
So true.
His diary is full of how fun it is to be camping all the time, how he kind of loves the food, which reminds him of his like lower class upbringing, and he kind of finds the constant artillery fire being launched across the river and skirmishes to be like exhilarating and fun. So John Lovett becomes like a
So he goes from
pro-war
being
guy.
like a proto-Marxist in a sense, like an early socialist, straight into being like an early Mussolini.
Basically, yes, this guy has a very similar character trajectory to Mussolini. To bolster Van Rensselaer's force of 6,000 New York militia, Dearborn sends a further 1,200 regular troops under the command of General Alexander Smith. Alexander Smith is under orders to report to Van Rensselaer as his superior. Unfortunately for Van Rensselaer, General Smith is the exact wrong man for the job, as he does not recognize the authority of militia commanders, no matter their rank. So, when Smith arrives in Niagara, he immediately heads south to Buffalo, and whenever Van Rensselaer sends letters to him ordering him to return to Niagara, Smith just does not answer them and pretends he never received them. Effectively, Smith's 1,200 regulars
Another thing that you can't really do these days.
Smith's regulars are basically not available for Van Rensselaer's upcoming advance across the river. When word reaches Van Rensselaer, the Americans have been defeated at Detroit, and he subsequently sees Hull's defeated army trudging along the border across the river towards imprisonment in York a couple months later, he is spurred to action and begins immediate preparations to cross. He plans to cross the river as soon as the ceasefire expires. There are immediately three problems. As we said before, Smith refuses to help in any way. He ignores every order sent his way and refuses to participate in plans to cross the river. Another issue is that several militia regiments have not been paid in months, as the New York State Legislature is full of Federalists who refuse to approve budgets that fund the militia. Van Rensselaer spends weeks negotiating back compensation. He has to pay some man out of his personal fortune before he is ready to attack. And then, finally, on the actual day of the crossing, well over 1,000 militia straight up refuse to cross due to the frustratingly vague militia contract. Luckily, the militia boat service agrees to cross, and Van Rensselaer finally attacks across the Niagara River, weeks after he initially planned, on the 13th of October, 1812. Van Rensselaer's final head count when he prepares to cross the Niagara is 3,550 men, all militia. Well more than the 800 British regulars and 200 Canadian militia in the area. There is also the Mohawk Nation. The Mohawks still have a native reservation in the area, but the Mohawk have not yet joined the war and have refused to join Tecumseh's confederacy altogether, citing the fact that they are already part of a confederacy, the Iroquois, or Haudenosaunee. The British are still trying to negotiate a Mohawk entry to the war at this point, so he discounts their presence. He and Solomon hope that if they can leverage surprise, they can make it to the Durand Farm, which is at the western elbow of Lake Ontario. The Durand Farm is nowadays referred to as Hamilton, Ontario, but that does not exist yet. The Durand Farm has a road running through it from Toronto, then York, to Detroit. So the garrison in Detroit is supplied from York. If Van Rensselaer can capture Durand's farm, he can cut Detroit off from supplies and encircle it. Unfortunately for Van Rensselaer, Brock has already returned to the area, and has his men watching the American side of the river. As soon as Van Rensselaer begins his crossing, he is immediately spotted, and an artillery battery is assembled on the Queenston Height redoubts and begins shelling the shoreline. Van Rensselaer comes across and is immediately hit by an artillery shell, lodging shrapnel in his thigh. The first American wave is forced to ground, and the halt advances as they're forced into cover. Van Rensselaer is then hit again, this time in the heel, then 3 more times in both calves and the other thigh. His legs are like hamburger meat at this point. He is withdrawn from the field and treated in New York for the remainder of the battle. So immediately the commanding officer of the American side is withdrawn. Van Rensselaer's second wave, led by Militia General Christie, moves to reinforce the beachhead so that they can advance. General Christie's boat is immediately hit by a British artillery shell, and Christie is forced to withdraw. A sudden current surge also blows several American boats off course, and the boats land right in a Canadian militia camp, leading to several companies being immediately captured by Canadian forces. Nonetheless, with fresh reinforcements, Van Rensselaer is able to detach 2 companies to sneak around the British guns in a raid to disable the British artillery so the advance can continue. At this point, Brock is smugly overseeing the gun batteries and admiring the slaughter his defenses are reaping on the American soldiers. He is set upon by the American raiders the Americans have sent to disable the guns, and Brock immediately in a panic destroys his own gun battery to prevent it falling into enemy hands and makes a panicked retreat down the hill to the British lines. He dispatches a messenger to his subordinate, General Sheaffe, in York, demanding Sheaffe bring the regulars stationed there to Queenston to help out. Brock is determined to hold the heights overseeing the American advance, so he collects a company to retake it. The men charge uphill against the American militia, and Brock is immediately shot in the chest. In Canadian legend, his lost words are, "Press on, York volunteers," apparently, which is definitely not true.
Not apparently, he did. He'd say that.
This is definitely not true, as not only were there no York volunteers in the area or with him, the soldiers in the charge were largely from Lancaster, England. Brock was also shot in such a way that would have probably instantly killed him. You can see the coat he was wearing that day in the Canadian War Museum today. He was shot basically right through the heart.
Mm-hmm. See, on a normal person that would kill. Brock didn't die instantly.
That's I believe it. Brock might have been a little confused. Maybe they messed up volunteers for fellow Brits or something like that. But I think he has it in him. But we've arrived at a third thing that you can't get away with anymore. Now, you used to always have these heroic death speeches and stuff like that, just the coolest little quotes. Now you just have a camera stuck in your face and you go, "Please don't kill me," and then you get shot.
Like in a Civil War by Alex Garland. How would Alex Garland treat the War of 1812? So, Brock's attack is repulsed, and MacDonald, a York lawyer who has joined Brock's staff, is despondent when he sees Brock's charge fail. He decides to avenge Brock and assembles another charge to retake the hill. Would it surprise you if I said the exact same thing happens again, and MacDonald is also shot through the chest and dies instantly? A runner is sent to Sheaffe to inform him that Brock has died and the situation is deteriorating. So
we're what, 0 for 4 on advances right now?
Yeah. So Brock is dead. MacDonald is dead. A messenger is dispatched to Sheaffe, who is currently marching as fast as he can to Hamilton. A horseman intercepts Sheaffe's forced march south and informs Sheaffe that Brock is dead. Sheaffe is disturbed by the news and is worried that Brock's immense popularity, followed by his immediate death, will demoralize the British troops and asks the messenger not tell anyone else. The messenger then proceeds down the line, and when the men ask him what message he delivered, he immediately tells them that Brock is dead, to Sheaffe's chagrin, but fortunately it motivates rather than depresses the troops, who are now determined to avenge Brock and drive the Americans out. As he is marching, Sheaffe is intercepted by 300 Mohawk warriors who have decided that the Mohawk are going to join the British side after all, so he picks them up. while the Mohawk are not part of Tecumseh's Confederacy and have vacillated on whether or not they will join up to this point, the Mohawk do have a reason to hate the United States. You see, the Mohawk are not indigenous to Ontario. They used to live in upstate New York. When the Americans won the Revolution, they drove the Iroquois out of upstate New York and forced them to resettle in Ontario. The Mohawk hope that if they help the British will restore them to upstate New York. When Sheaffe links up with the regulars and militia near Queenston Heights, he has about 1,300 troops, mostly British regulars. The American forces are 3,000 American militia. A heated battle ensues in which the British regulars and Mohawk warriors basically hard carry the York Volunteers. The York Volunteers sort of just confusedly march around and don't do anything, while the British regulars and Mohawk absolutely BTFO the vastly outnumbering American force. Over the course of the day, the Americans are pushed steadily back to the Niagara River, where they eventually run up against the riverbank. The Americans then send for the boats to come get them, so they can retreat back to New York and into Niagara. But the militia boats refuse to cross because they are not required to cross over to Canadian soil due to their militia contract.
Oh my god.
When asked for their reasoning, the militia boatmen say they are scared of the Mohawk and don't want to cross within musket range of the Iroquois warriors. So, Van Rensselaer's army is stuck at the banks. When the British and Mohawk press up to the American army and begin firing, with Van Rensselaer back in New York and no boats crossing to carry orders back and forth, the highest-ranking American in the area, Winfield Scott, who will become famous later on for other accomplishments, strikes the American colors and surrenders, waving a white flag. The British cease fire, but the Mohawk continue shooting the Americans for several minutes until they get bored. With Brock dead, the will to counterattack dies with him.
I can't really blame him. I can't really blame him, you know?
Yes, the War of 1812
I imagine they have some unresolved issues.
As I said before, the Mohawk have reason to hate the Americans. They were kicked out of their homeland by the Americans after the Revolution, right? So, but the war will continue to have the indigenous sort of taking out their frustrations on surrendered Americans. That will be a recurring theme. With Brock dead,
I'm not gonna advocate for war crimes, but they didn't exist really in the same capacity at this point. I don't think, unless I'm just completely wrong there.
I mean, they had customs of war, they had a concept of war crimes, but not an international criminal court or code. The Geneva Convention didn't exist yet, but there certainly was a concept of dishonorable conduct in war that white countries tried to avoid usually, especially when fighting other white people. Mm-hmm. So, with Brock dead, the will to counterattack dies with him. Sheaffe has the opportunity to advance across the Niagara River and occupy Niagara. The American army is destroyed, but he refuses. And once again, a temporary ceasefire is negotiated with Dearborn. So, with their advance into Sandwich, destroyed and humiliated, their advance into Queenston Heights, obliterated by the British and Mohawk, Washington is fed up with the conduct of the war, and decides to activate their secret weapon. William Henry Harrison is summoned from Vincennes, Indiana, to D.C., and given command of a new force of militia from Kentucky. His orders: march north and liberate Detroit. Kill as many Indians as you can on the way. Harrison happily accepts and begins the march north, where he will meet the British in Frenchtown, Michigan, in January of 1813. This brings us to the final event of the 1812 campaign season, as Harrison begins his march north. At this point, D.C. is aware of the militia problem and decides to plan around it. They can't raise more regulars because no one wants to join the regular army. So instead, they activate the Kentucky militia. The Kentuckians are staunch indigenous haters and frontier warriors, as well as being generally deeply imperialistic and aligned with the warhawk Henry Clay, who we discussed last episode. When the call for a Kentucky militia is given out...
They're in it for the love of the game.
Yes, these guys truly love killing, especially indigenous people. when the call for a Kentucky militia is given out with a quota of 5,500 men, so many Kentuckians sign up that a large chunk of them have to be turned away because the state government literally cannot afford to pay and equip them. The Kentucky government is so confident its militia will conquer the British and Tecumseh's Confederacy that they only sign the men onto a 6-month contract.
Why do Kentuckians hate these people?
Kentucky borders Tecumseh's Confederacy and has received a large and has been at the brunt of many raids from Tecumseh.
And refugees, probably.
Yeah. As he moves north, Harrison picks up some regular troops and loses some militia as they are redeployed to the other failing American offensives. Upon arriving at Fort Wayne, the rearmost American outpost on the Detroit front, Harrison comes under the command of the new regional commander, General James Winchester, who has inherited the Northwest Army from the captured Hull. Harrison and Winchester do not get along, and Harrison's men become insubordinate. The Kentuckians signed up to fight under the hero of Tippecanoe, not Winchester, who they hate. You see, the Kentuckian militia hates the regular army. They view them as unprincipled mercenaries, as opposed to these idealized citizen soldiers. This is a common belief amongst Democratic Republicans who view sort of America as this homesteader republic in the vein of like ancient Rome. They don't like the idea of this regular army of paid soldiers who don't work on farms during the off-season. So the Kentucky militia begins bullying Winchester with the goal of getting him to resign. Most of their pranks are toilet-based. Quote, at one camp, they skin a porcupine and place the skin on a pole over the latrine pit. The general applied his buttocks to the hide with painful results. And in another case, the Kentucky militia sabotage an outhouse toilet seat so that the general falls into a pool of shit when he sits on it. Eventually, command of the Detroit front is relinquished by Winchester and given to Harrison, and the two men swap roles. By now, it is winter time. Harrison's opposite in the Detroit front is Lieutenant Colonel Henry Proctor, who is running a joint command of British regulars, Canadian militia, and indigenous warriors from Tecumseh's Confederacy. This is proving a logistical nightmare, especially since the ideological core of Tecumseh's Confederacy means that the indigenous troops don't particularly trust nor like Proctor and his white officers, making coordinating efforts between the two groups very difficult. To make matters worse, the horrific violence of the American militia that has been going on in the Confederacy at this point has the indigenous troops more prone to violence than usual. They've been shooting prisoners, murdering enemy civilians, and looting in contravention of European military customs. If for no reason than to just get them out of Detroit, Proctor detaches the indigenous troops from his army and sends them on an advance south towards the Maumee River, spelt Maumee, but pronounced Maumee, dividing Michigan and Ohio. He sends the Canadian militia with the indigenous because he hopes that the Canadian colonials will be a moderating force. Proctor views the Canadians as sort of halfway between white British people and indigenous, these like frontier wild men. So he hopes that they can negotiate sort of a well-behaved advance. The official orders that the indigenous and militia are given are to collect French-Canadian civilians living in the American Midwest and remove them to Ontario for resettlement. The rationale here is twofold. First of all, French Canadians are British subjects. And secondly, their farms could potentially supply Harrison's army in the spring, and therefore need to be destroyed before Harrison reaches the front lines. So as the natives and the Canadians advance, fleeing civilians reach Winchester's camp and plead for assistance. Winchester and Harrison, remember, don't like each other, so Winchester has been given leave to establish his own camp separate from Harrison's, closer to the front. They report that the town they're coming from, literally Frenchtown is the name, on the River Raisin, just north of the Maumee, has been seized by a small force of 100 indigenous and 50 Canadians. Winchester has three choices. Number one, withdraw to Harrison's camp, which he absolutely refuses to do. Not only does he hate Harrison, He has received orders from his superiors that America keeps getting embarrassed. Under no circumstances is he to embarrass them further with his behavior. His second option is to notify Harrison and ask permission to attack. And his third option is attacking without permission before reinforcements can arrive at Frenchtown. He takes the third option and prepares to liberate the city. He sends a message back to Harrison detailing his plans, but the message gets lost in transit. It's not like Tecumseh captures the messenger. Literally, the messenger just gets lost. It's only right before the battle is about to start that Harrison receives a request for reinforcements. A bewildered Harrison orders some of his men to take the 65-mile trek to relieve Winchester. When the vanguard of Winchester's army arrives on the scene on January 18th, 1813, the Americans have around 700 men. 600 Kentucky militia, and 100 French-Canadian refugees fleeing the Canadian and Indigenous advance. The Canadian and Indigenous forces at this point consist of 200 Potawatomi warriors and 63 Canadian militia, hauling a single ancient cannon. The Americans swiftly retake the town with their overwhelming numbers, and Harrison's forces arrive shortly thereafter under the command of Colonel George Madison, who is the cousin of the president. Hearing about the confrontation, Proctor leaves Detroit with his British regulars and concentrates British and Indigenous forces in the area for a counterattack. When he arrives at Frenchtown, the British are the ones with the overwhelming numbers this time. Even though Harrison has thousands of troops across the Detroit front, only 1,000 are present for this battle. Proctor, on the other hand, along with Confederate generals Roundhead and Walk in the Water, that is their real names, have 1,400 troops between them. Just before the sunrise on January 22nd, Proctor, Roundhead, and Walk in the Water launch their attack. The Americans are taken by surprise. Winchester is immediately captured, and the bulk of the American army is forced to withdraw across the river. Within 20 minutes, 220 American soldiers are killed. 3 regiments of Kentucky militia fortify the town and prepare to hold out. When the Potawatomi inform the Americans that Winchester has been captured and the battle is already over, the Kentuckians refuse to surrender and fight on for 3 hours as the British and Indigenous slowly encircle them. Eventually, American officer George Madison brokers a surrender under the condition that the town is spared. At the end of the battle, 400 casualties have occurred on the American side. A further 547 prisoners of war have been taken. On the Anglo-Confederate side, only 200 casualties have occurred. Proctor tries to get Walk in the Water to order the Potawatomi to burn Frenchtown, denying it to future American use. But the Potawatomi refuse on the grounds that there is no point in doing so. The population has long since been forcefully transferred back to Ontario. What would be the point? The next day, the British withdraw and leave the Potawatomi in charge of the prisoners. What happens next will galvanize American commitment to wiping out Tecumseh's Confederacy. As soon as the British are gone, a large portion of the Potawatomi force moves back to Detroit, taking any Americans with them strong enough to walk. This long walk turns into a death march, with the Potawatomi killing any American who falls by the roadside and is unable to keep up. Meanwhile, back in Frenchtown, the remaining Potawatomi troops begin systematically slaughtering the wounded Americans left in the town. Between 30 and 100 American prisoners of war, sources vary, are slaughtered, including several prominent Kentucky politicians and businessmen. So for the remainder of the war, Kentucky troops will shout, "Remember the Raisin," in reference to the river this massacre occurred on, and American enlistment in the South and the West swells. The 1812 campaign season ends on January 23rd, 1813, with the Battle of Frenchtown, once again with a humiliating American defeat. The two armies settle in for a few months of winter camping and begin planning the 1813 season, which we will cover in part 3 when we talk about the second half of the war and its aftermath.